My guest today is Bergsvein Birgisson, who has written the Svarte Vikingen, which I am holding up here, or the Black Viking in English. And he's your ancestor the way times 30, if I remember correctly. But how did you stumble upon this guy? Was it the family folk tale, or did you just randomly stumble upon him?
Yeah, so we're doing this in English.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it was, in a way, it was a family anecdote that ignited the interest for this figure. We had, or my parents had a friend that had moved from the most northern part of the West Fjords. The West Fjords in Iceland is on a number. It's like said like this. So the Westfjords in the north here. This was the area of this guy that I have called the Black Viking, or his name was Geirmundur Heljarskin in Old Norse. And this guy came. He had moved there in the 1950s from northern Westfjords, and he told stories about Geirmund, and he was a great hero for him in his eyes. And I always remembered those stories, and when I started to study Old Norse in the university, I started to collect, like in the early 90s, I started to collect all the fragments about this guy, Geirmundur Heljarskin, in the written sources. And I saw that many of the stories that the guy had told me were not written down anywhere. And that was like, and but basically there were some paradoxes in the way Icelanders treated this figure, this guy. The paradox was that he was the mightiest, he was the greatest of all settlers in Iceland, but they didn't want to tell his story, or why he was so rich and powerful, and they didn't want to put him on the genealogical lists. It's always his daughter that is listed up, not him. So there was something like intriguing there. Why are they not proud of him? Why didn't they want to speak about him? Why are there only fragments? So that was, in a way, yeah, that what sparked the interest and I guess the study.
We're going to get into his life in a second, but I want to begin with, like you mentioned, the sources are not many, and he does not have his own saga. Do you think there was some racist racism behind this, that is because of his darker skin, that they didn't want to tell the story?
Yeah, well, basically, what I tried to outline in the last chapter of the book is that like in the High Middle Ages, in the 12th and the 13th century, when Icelanders were writing a lot, we could say that there is established a kind of myth of foundation, or foundation myth of Iceland is established. And it's quite well. There was a little elite that was writing, and I guess they were like they knew one another, and in a way, as I see it, they sat down and they said that this is the way we're going to present the beginning of Iceland for the world. So we make this myth, and basically the myth that they established is a myth that you cannot get Geirmundur to fit into it in any way, because you can start with that, which you mentioned, that the focus in this foundation myths that the writers of the Middle Ages put weight on was Norway and the Norwegians. And okay, there were a few Celtic slaves, but it was mostly Norwegians that came here. We don't want to speak about the other people or people from other, it's a kind of xenophobic tendency there. It's not racist, but it's just xenophobic, and they want to come from Norway. And Geirmund was black. He was like some kind of a Greenlandish, Mongolian, some Yiddish appearance. Okay, and he was not purely Norse, although his father was. The second part is that during the 12th and the 13th century, there was a kind of a civil war in Iceland, and just a few families had like gathered all the resources of this little country, and the writers looked at this as unfortunate, and it is a very strong tendency in the human life in general to to make a time that where everything was better in the past days, when everything was better. It's like, you go to Horace, you read about Horace, and he says in his older days, now the Romans, they can't do anything anymore. The young Romans, they're just degenerated and they're terrible. But back in my old days, everything was better. So they made a kind of golden age where every chieftain in the country was like it was like an egalitarian society. They wanted to show that everything began there, where the chieftains had the same power everywhere, and nobody was like threatening or forcing others. They had kind of a general assembly where everyone had their voice. And Geirmund, the Black Viking, he does not fit into this at all, because as we can see that he is basically taking northwestern part of nearly all the island, nearly all the northern western part. He is behaving like a petty king. He has between, according to my calculations and out from the sources, he has around 200 to 300 slaves, and very many farms, and so-called chieftains that are under him and under his command. So he does not fit into this egalitarian society that they wanted to show. The other things that he does not fit into is that you can see when he takes his land in Iceland, that he is not thinking about running after some like high seat pillars, like it was a myth that the first settlers, they threw out some 2 pillars, and where the pillars came up, they set up their farm. We can see that it's purely economic settlement from Geirmundur. He is only thinking about the resources, how to work them out, how to transport them, how to get them to Ireland, or where he sold them. So it's an economical settlement, and that was not. The fourth thing we could mention also is that, and has been mentioned before, we have a very few mentions of the Celtic people that came to Iceland. The DNA research in the past decades has shown that over 65% of all the women that
Wow.
came to Iceland were Celtic. And the written sources do not show this, and of course we can assume that many of them were slaves, and just as much came from or was taken of Celtic men, and so I mentioned that he had out from all his farms and where he was working the resources, he has around 200 to 300 slaves. So this was not either any historian they wanted to mention, and that's quite understandable because uh, the new Christian in the Christian era, it's not allowed to have slaves. We are the slaves of our Lord, and we should not be slaves of one another. And of course, there was slavery and has always been and will be, but it's not called that, at least anymore. During the 11th century, slavery here is totally um,
Normal.
yeah, no, it's not normal. It's not mentioned anymore.
Hmm. Right.
So
So,
these are the main features that he didn't fit into.
so let's begin with his mother. She, like you said, she is from Mongolian ancestry. So, how did she end up with Geirmund's father and being a Norwegian concubine of all places?
Yeah, then we are moving towards the earlier steps of this story. We begin in the end in a way, and we go to a place now called Bjarmia in English, or Bjarmaland in Old Norse. It is known and accepted that the Norse people were sailing to the White Sea. They called it Gandvik already in the eighth century. They archaeologists have shown that they have found so much Norse over there, and now the sources, they say that the father of Geirmund, King Hjör, who apparently sat on Avaldsnes, Ögvaldsnes in Karmøy in Haugesund, by Haugesund in southwestern Norway, that he is sailing, he is making expeditions to Bjarmia. And it is said that he took a woman there. She has a very special name that is not Norse. It's Ljuvina. Ljuvina. It's like a Norse assimilation of some kind of strange or alien word or name. And my hypothesis is that, and that is based on what we know else, and this is the method that I have. You always have to fill in. You have to guess, because it's the sources are scarce, and you have to guess how this everything has turned out, and fill in the pictures in a way. So the written sources, they say he took her as a concubine and as a slave and moved her, but in the next sentence he said she is a queen. Okay, so what we're basically looking at there is that it's a kind of an economical alliance. And of course, if you're coming from southwestern Norway all the way to the White Sea to get some kind of goods, you have to get something. You are eager to trade something with these people. They have something that you need, and basically this is where the walrus studies came in, and not the teeth and that which the archaeologists find, but the skin for the ropes, for the boats, for the ships, and this is very simple. You know, a Viking chieftain living by the North Way, by the name of your country is North Way, the way along the coastline of Norway. Your power is completely dependent upon having ships. And having big ships, you have to have big ropes for the rig, for the sails, and for everything. So he's basically going there, and this is an alliance, an economical alliance. Marriage was not in these times based on love or something like that. That's more like a French. Could we say a French idea from the 12th, 13th, 12th century? It's an alliance, and in order to get these goods from these people in the north, he takes a woman from their flock, or from this people. And of course that's the best insurance to have a good access to the wares, to the goods in the north. So she is Ljubina, and I assume that she is like they were called Samoyeds. They were living there by the east side of the White Sea, and they were specialized in hunting walrus and making ropes and so forth. We have this beautiful little text from King Alfred's Hof in 9th century, where a Norwegian author comes to him and says that he has been to Bjermia, and that he went to Bjermia to get a hold of walrus, and that he is also buying ropes from them, 16 ells long ropes. So this is the grounds, and she has had then like a physiognomy or appearance that was not Germanic, but more like the Greenlanders and the Samoyedi people.
We should mention this as well, because and you mentioned this in your book as well, that and again we talked about this in our episode about Eric the Red, where the Muslim conquest of Africa closed down the ivory sale of elephants, which was quite popular to use as chess pieces or other products in Europe. So with the Muslim conquest, walrus hunting became really attractive, and it made a lot of money for the Norse because of the what's the word for it? The amount of requests they had because they couldn't get ivory from the elephants anymore.
Yeah, well, I don't know about the trade contacts to Africa in these times, but at least what is said is that it was the ivory from Africa that took over in the High Middle Ages, because we don't. But I basically think that the last pieces of ivory you got into the European market was from Greenland, and it seems that the scholars have documented that now with the DNA and stuff like that. So yes, you made a lot of money on the ivory, but that is not my focus in the book, because everyone focused on the ivory, because the ivory is the only thing you can see, the only thing you can touch. But it is a luxury item, and you do not sail from southwestern Norway or western Norway, wherever, all the way to the White Sea with a lot of men and back just to get a hold of some luxury item. You're not going to do that. That's no way. It's not a cruise. It's your life is dependent on this, it is something necessary, and that is where I focus on the heights, on the skin, and on the rope making, which was this is basically the strongest material to make ropes for a rig. And if you think about the bigger Viking ships and the sail they had, it's it's 100 and perhaps more than 100 square meters. It is you have to have this strong ropes if you want to be sure that you are going to survive, and it's basically that you get the strongest shit because you care about your life. You don't want to gamble with life.
Hmm. So let's talk about the German's childhood, because he was, as you mentioned in your book, his father was terrified when he saw him for the first time. He did basically disowned him, as far as I understood this. Does he have a twin brother, or does the brother come later in life?
Yeah, I'm not sure if they're twins, but that's what the written sources say, that they are twins. But if they're from the same marriage and from the same mother, and like her appearance is more dominating, I guess people can have thought that they were twins very easily. But uh, well, it's of course, and this is not science. This is like uh, based on experience. When I see, for example, Norse or Icelandic or Germanic looking people have children with, for example, Greenlanders. It can be both, you don't know,
Hmm.
but it seems that the dominating appearance in the brothers is from the mother, and that's perhaps most shocking for the father. And of course, we are here in some kind of a mythic landscape. We don't know so much, but what we have, what we can be sure about is his nickname,
Hmm.
Heljarskin. It means the black skinned. You don't make up nicknames 200 years later.
Hmm.
The nickname is something that lives and sticks by you. And at least we know from that he was a much darker. He had a darker skin than his fellow Norsemen,
Hmm.
and so we know that he is called very. He is titulated, and the brothers are called ugly, or extremely ugly in written sources. This is not, again, not racism. It's basically this little xenophobic nature, and the fact that often we think that beauty is what we know, and what is alien to us is more ugly. And I don't think this has changed so much in the human world.
Hmm. His childhood does not seem easy, as we mentioned. His father more or less disowned them, and they grew up with the slaves. They were thrown into with a slave mother that his mother was not did not raise him, and you mentioned this in the book as well, that even today, and this is true for today's era as well, if you are disowned by the parents and you don't have a good relationship with the parents, it can be difficult growing up and have a good relationship later with the parents. Was So let's talk about growing up for Yarman and his brother among the slaves, like you talked about in the book.
Yeah, well, again, we're in the written sources here, and I um, I think what I was doing there was like giving the echo of these scarce fragments, written fragments, and trying to see what could be true in it and how it could have formed him. Yes, it is said in the written sources that their father becomes very angry when he sees their appearance, or rather that the mother doesn't want him to see them because she knows that he will be angry because her appearance is dominating them. So what she does is that she changes them for a white newborn uh, slave son, and gives her twins to the slaves, and takes this slavery son and presents him as the son of the father. He sees that when they grow, when this youngster grows up, that he is not his son, and he's more like a slavery. I don't know how he saw that. But of course, this is like, I'm guessing into this scarce written sources, and I don't want to philosophize so much about that here now. I'm just trying to show that if there is something true in this, I think Geirmundur, if he started the life like that, he must have been quite suspicious of people. He doesn't trust people. He's taken from his mother and brought up with some slaves, and then suddenly he's taken back again into the warmth of the family when he's they're 3-4 years old, according to the sources. They're taken back, and everything is fine. But you always have this, when will I go out to the cold again? So that's what I was trying to guess, and that's perhaps what I am doing, because I am an Old Norse philologist. I have a doctor grade in reading these old texts, but I am also a writer. So what I'm trying to do, basically in this book, is to combine both of the parts of the brain in this text, and trying to somehow get the persons to be get to become something more than just skeletons, and try to get under their skin, and try to understand how this life was. But this is like in mist. This is unclear. The sources are scarce. The sources are also paradoxical. They but we have this poem which tells about, and I guess it was a skaldic poem, and because of this stanza, the story around their birth and their upbringing among the slaves, and the stanza also tells about how they're taken back into the king's court, and get the warmth of their mother and father. So this stanza, and this is important, and this is not a statement that I'm giving without something behind it. I wrote a thesis on skaldic poetry, 500 pages, a doctoral thesis, which I think only 3 persons have read, because it was 3 in the committee to give a doctor grade. But well, anyway, I and other scholars have stated the same thing, that these stanzas from the 9th and 10th century, many of them are fictional or made in the High Middle Ages, but many of them cannot be made in the 12th or 13th century. They are old. There can be something wrong in them. There can be some variants that are wrong in manuscripts, but in basically these poems are old, and these are the only poems. This is the only sources we have that we could call like a primer sources from the oral society, and the Norse mind was able to code historical
Events.
yes, events or something like that the society really wanted to secure, that you didn't forget. Then you get the skald and you get him to make the poem, and then it is like it will stand with us. And this is a way of the oral society to take care to secure some kind of a social memory in this society. And so we have a stanza and we have this with Geirmundur, but yeah, a suspicious mind came out from this. That was the point I tried to find out from the scarce sources.
I want to do an analogy here because when I read the book of Adrian Goldsworthy about the Punic War, he states that the Romans began writing their history around this time, and it was maybe not necessarily to just remember their history, but it was also for entertainment as well, to entertain themselves by the campfire or by the families to tell the story. Was this the case in Norse mythology Norse poetry as well?
Yeah, I guess the Romans were quite before.
I mean, just to do an analogy here, like what was the poems and stanzas you said, just to
exactly.
the entertainment as well as telling the history.
Yeah. It's the entertainment. It's it's basically the same. And even though the Greek Romans also had other genres that we didn't have in the north, like the plays and theater. We had the hall and the King's Hall in northern Europe and in Scandinavia, and we can see it from sources that the skalds, like I can mention, like a skald like Einar Skúlason. He is a fantastic skald who makes skaldic poetry about myths and about historical events and so forth. But he is also a good storyteller. And the skald is, I think it was like that the skald had this aura and he had this nimbus. He had status, a very big status. He was like the news and the entertainer in par excellence. He was like the best friend of the king. Of course, we always see this strong ties between those who are in power and those who can picture them, and those who can tell people what to think about them. So the skald is there, and he is telling perhaps the myths and the stories, and then comes the poems. Then come the poems afterwards. That's basically how I think it was done, and as we see in for example, Snorri Sturluson, I think it's quite good how he looks at these poems as like a historical data, because many of the poems were recited in front of the kings, and if it was a lie, if it wasn't true about the king and his deeds, of course it wouldn't have been gone. It wouldn't have gone unnoticed, and the king would take it more as a mockery than a real sublimation or something like that. So you can count on these poems, and basically it is the entertainment par excellence, but it's a different aesthetics. We can't go into that now, but it's like you are able, because your brain is, there is so little coming into your brain, uh, and when you hear a poem, you can learn it by heart. I guess you could do that because every second word rhymes basically in skaldic poetry. So it's and we have sources on that people learned the stanzas by heart, and then they went doing their work, or they went walking for some days, and when they were home, they had understood the stanza.
Mm.
So it's a totally different aesthetics in this society than you have in modern society, where you should, like, you're more like a, you're not asked to participate with your thinking. You just entertain me.
Yeah. So let's go back to Geirmund. We did derail that a little bit there, but let's go. What made you move to Iceland in the first place from Norway? Didn't you feel like you had a future in Norway?
Sorry, you talk about Geirmund, or?
Yeah, that's what we're talking
Yeah,
about.
yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah.
Well, no, it's I would not say that he moves from Norway to Iceland. That would be forgetting the medium states, which is Ireland
All right.
and Dublin. We have quite a lot of sources on him that he establishes himself in Dublin in the second half of 9th century, 860, 70. And we can see from the genealogies that he and his, like, comrades and forced brothers, or whatever we could call them, blood brothers, Ulfur Skjalgi, and they are there in Dublin. And Geirmund basically, it's they are allied with Eyvindur Austmaður. It's kind of a Swede that was working there in Dublin and building boats and stuff like that, and they are allied to Olaf the White, Olaf Hviti, and Ivar the Boneless, and everything is focused on, again, on this most powerful thing that the Viking Age produced, the Viking ship. So my idea is that that there are circulating, when they come to Dublin, there are circulating stories about the Thule and this island in the north. And another thing has happened there, and that is that Harald the Fairhair, Haraldur Harfagri, he has put a monopoly on trade with northern Norway and the eastern part of northern Norway, like to Bjarmia. And so petty kings like King Hjör, father of Geirmund, he can't get there anymore without paying a lot of taxes. It was not, at least in later times, rare that you had to pay like 50% taxes of the goods you were trading to your king. So basically, Geirmund, he is called in there because he has some kind of knowledge to both hunt this walrus animal that I guess followed the stories about Thule and this island in the north, and he knows how to make the goods out of them, make the ropes and make the train oil from their blubber, and so forth. So he's sent when he is sent to the first expeditions to Iceland. I guess it was in the late 860s. He has to have an economy in his back, because it's expensive to make an expedition to island many days in the north. So basically, it must be Olaf the White and the shipbuilder, Eyvindur Austmaður, who need this goods from the walruses in order to both sustain their ships and in order to be able to make more ships, which is vital for a king like those in Dublin. So basically, that is the starting point for the expedition to Iceland. Geirmundur is, and his father is not mentioned. He just vanishes out of history, but we know that there was a great battle, and the petty king Harald the Fair, he is able to announce himself as king of all of Norway. We know that he was not king of all of Norway. He was basically in the west of Norway, but anyway, the father of Geirmund is one of the losers there, and there is nothing to go to for Geirmund in Norway anymore, because if it is right, as I assumed from my studies, that King Hjör was on Avaldsnes on Karmøy, that is one of the central places for the old Norwegian sailing route. And of course, Haraldur, as we know, took that farm under his command as soon as he could, as he did with all other central places on the sailing route along Norway.
It's funny. The way I understood it when I read Snorri is basically that Harald did this because he was kind of horny for this girl that he wanted, and that's the only reason why he unified unified Norway, quote unquote, because he wanted this girl. He was basically horny for her. That's the way I understood this when I read Snorri. That's the reason he did
it. Yeah, well, Snorri says that, but other sources say other things. Snorri was very good in bringing forth the human side of everyone, and I think his attraction for Gyða is well. It's not only Snorri. It's mentioned in also in a poem, a skaldic poem, and in Ágrip, if I remember right. So there could be something in it, but of course, many of the deeds that men do are to get the eyes of women. That's also something true.
But yeah, let's go back to Geirmund again. And you mentioned he goes to Iceland, and you mentioned also in the beginning that he has about 200, 300 slaves with him. Does he take slaves with him from Ireland when he goes to Iceland? Does he take slaves with him from there to Ireland?
Yeah, he takes them from Ireland. Now, Dublin in these in this era of 860, 870 is basically the biggest trading post for slaves in all of Northern Europe. So, and the interesting thing here is when Geirmund is establishing himself in Iceland in 860s, 70s, in the age of settlement, as we call it, the prices on slaves are at the peak, at the highest, basically because of the demand from the east, from the Islam, from the Muslims, which needed slaves, and you know, a slave sold from Dublin, slavery woman, for example, she could not know if she would end in Baghdad or in Iceland. You know, we have this net drawn up, and you have seen in many books about the Viking age, that you were trading slaves, you know, in all directions from Dublin. So basically, you know, you're speaking about perhaps up to 600 dirham, 600 dirham, where the Muslims paying for one slave, female slave. That's the highest. It would be like basically 2.3 million Norwegian kroner, in very a wild guess while you're trying to put the dirhams into that modern times. But
The IRS would have a field day for sure.
yeah. But so it's not possible, you know, for Geirmund to establish himself without, as I said and mentioned, having some kind of a kingship, dynasty in his back, and he didn't need any money. He couldn't use any money. He just needed slaves to establish himself in Iceland, and all of the white is taking slaves. He is mentioned in many of the Irish annals and Scottish annals as Anleib, and we know that, for example, in 871 he takes around 500 slaves just in one, on St. Patrick's Day in Armagh, 500 slaves. He goes with Ivor the Boneless with 200 ships and fills them with slaves in 871. 200 ships. Let's put 10 slaves in each ship. 2,000. So it's a big shop, and of course, in these when we are in this era, the times where the Vikings could plunder and rob cloisters and churches, and this era is over. So basically, you have to get some new fuel to keep the shop going, you know, and that's basically selling people, taking slaves and selling them, and this is where Geirmund establishes himself. You know, gradually he's going back and forth. He's selling the goods in Dublin. He's getting paid with slaves, and he gets more slaves to Iceland. Yeah, so this is basically the as I pictured it, and as I find sense into this story.
Does he take any of the female slaves as concubines when like his father did, or does he abstain from this?
Yeah, well, as I was trying to mention in the beginning with the father, I'm not sure that Ljuvina was a concubine at all. It just said in the written sources that she was a concubine, but in the next sentence it said that she was a queen. So it's at least not known that his father had any other women. Yes, well, that's basically the fate of female slave that your master in addition to using you as like an agricultural slave or something, he is able to use the women sexually, and I cannot see that this has been any different in Iceland. Icelanders have never been like pictured as or depicted as very Puritan people, and of course we have the DNA, which tells us that the slaves are still in us. Peter Foot said it in the Viking Achievement that a slave cannot leave behind him anything. He cannot own anything, and he leaves nothing. That's not quite true. If because of this concubines, and so the slaves are leaving their DNA in the people. That's quite sure, or else they would not be able to depict that.
He does seem to, and I want to talk about this. I don't know if it's past this already, so do forgive me if I'm doing a little back here. But he does seem in your book that he has a feud with a Torbjörn Bitrag for a while.
Yeah, well, that's another quite scarce source. I don't know if we can go into that so deeply here. It's not.
Oh no, we just mentioned it real briefly.
Yeah,
That's fine.
Yeah, it's basically Thorbjörn Betra is one of the men who has come in his way. Basically, when Geirmundur is taking Breiðafjörður and Westfjord, the fjords and the west fjords of Iceland, and Strandir especially, he established himself here in Strandir also. There are not so many people there. There are not many chieftains in his way, but there are some. And the reason that we get these stories, not only about Thorbjörn Bitra, but Krókur and Króksfjörður and Steinólfur Lági, his foster brother, is also battling against some chieftains. It's because they are there before them. And it will be very expensive to adopt them into their company. So they try to take them out of the way, basically. And in the story of Thorbjörn, it seems that Thorbjörn he has already established himself as the owner of the fjord, and then a ship full of walrus goods from Strandir breaks up there in his on the coastline, which belongs to him. And according to old laws, like of the Gragas and Gulathing, it was his property that drifted ashore there. But and he's basically a man who's trying to get his early pension and get a hold of these very valuable goods coming from the north. So that's why Geirmundur gets rid of him, I guess.
So let's talk about it. Like you mentioned, he wanted to establish a dynasty. So let's talk about how does he establish a family? Where does it? How meet his wife? Is it set up? Does it meet her? Does it find another chieftain, or who he marries off to, or how does it? Is it an arranged marriage? When he get married eventually?
Yeah, you're talking about the family of Geirmundur.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there is it's like a very complicated again story, and we have like skipped that part in his vita, in his life history. We have skipped the part of Bjarmia and Bjarmaland, but basically my research underpins the theory that Geirmund must have gone with his father to Bjarmia, and he has been with these people and learned from them, or else he would not have been so much attraction for those in Dublin to send to Iceland. It's because he knows something about how to hunt and how to make these goods from big seals and walruses. So King Hjör, which has taken a wife in his alliance with his Samoyedic people, Bjarmi people, or whatever we want to call them, Sikirtia people, or which I think they were. He wants to do the same for his son, Geirmund, to ensure that the family has access to the goods. So this is the mythical figure of Ilturka. Ilturka was her name, according to the Icelandic sources. It's not a Norse name at all. It's like Ljúfina and Haris and Loptaina and whatever, these words, these are assimilations, Norse assimilations of some kind of names from an alien language. Okay, we at least we can be agree on that. Exactly what people is more like difficult to determine. But yes, Ilturka was his wife, and he establishes himself. She is said to be buried in Iceland, and her burial mound is still detectable, and it's called Ilturka. And there were some local people there who pointed it out for me, and nobody knew about this. It's a big, it's like in northern Norway, it's like helix stones that are up in a pile. And this was registered by the archaeologist after people there in the area pointed this out to me. This is the only flat stone grave mound in Iceland, actually. So Ilturka comes with Geirmundur, perhaps some more of the Bjarmi people. We do not know that. But at least we know this, and this needs to be studied further, that there is like an oriental mutation or oriental gene and a mutation in this oriental gene in Icelanders that the Samis in Norway or Scandinavia and the Norwegians do not have. And that's interesting. And as the DNA is quite sensitive, it's sufficient that only one female woman comes with the DNA, and if she gets a lot of like people descendants, these mutations can live in Iceland, and there are mutations in the Icelanders that you only can find in the Samoyedi people in originating from the Sayan and the Baikal area in Mongolia.
Interesting. What would you say? I think we're not rounding it up there, but what do you say is the legacy of Geirmund and the Black Viking? Because he never went on the raids. He never went on Viking raids. He never did
No,
that if
no,
this traditional
exactly.
thing.
He was not the typical Viking. It's not how we see him. He's black.
Mhm,
He has like a flat face. A white flat face, and he is not a man going and plundering and killing people. No, he's not doing any Viking. There are no stories about him plundering or pillaging some people. He is a very good hunter. He is a very good engineer. He is a very good like a project manager
mhm,
and uh, uh, incredibly practical thinking man.
mhm. And he's your family as well, times 30.
Yeah, well, I found that out. When I was finishing the book. That actually,
Mhm,
I think I'm number 30 or 31. 30 from him. Yeah, so I'm a direct descendant from him in the 30th
mhm,
uh, generation from him.
mhm.
But
That's
I guess many other Icelanders are.
that's really cool, and I do hope that this book is translated into English so that others outside Scandinavia will be able to read about him as well if they found this
Yeah,
episode interesting.
actually, it has.
Oh,
We've just not found the right publisher yet, and perhaps, yeah, but time will show.
hmm. I hope it does get published quite soon. And thank you so much for coming on. Do you have anything you want to promote? Any social media where people might find you if they have any questions about German or Viking history?
Now, I have a homepage I'm putting up now, and there will be contacts there. It's just my name and is. And everyone can find that.
Hmm. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you on. My name is Alan. This has been about That Aged Well. You can find us on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcast, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you are on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please consider writing a review if you like this episode. That would help us out a lot. And please check out some other history of that we covered on this podcast. We also covered another Viking history about Eirik the Red, which I highly recommend checking out. My name's Alan. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.